Hello, in this lecture we're going to talk about market failure versus government failure, Chapter 8. We're going to start off with a quote from Will Rogers, who was a performer, and his quote is, "The business of government is to keep the government out of business. That is, unless business needs government aid." So the idea here being that the classical economic approach would be that we're going to remove the government for the most part and let the market take care of things. Why? Because that usually leads to the most efficient outcome. However, we are going to note in this lecture that there are problems in that system, and we're going to talk about when there's going to be failures in the market, what type of failures there might be, and then try to think about what kind of actions should be in place to fix or alleviate those type of errors. Objectives of the chapter: explain what an externality is and show how it affects the market outcome. Describe 3 methods of dealing with externalities. Define public good and explain the problem with determining the value of public good to society. Explain how informational and moral hazard problems can lead to market failure, and explain why market failure is not necessarily a reason for government intervention. Okay, so we're going to talk about market failure first, so let's define market failure. A market failure is a situation in which the invisible hand pushes in such a way that individual decisions do not lead to socially desirable outcomes. So remember, the idea of the invisible hand is, of course, to let the market take control and determine some of these vital questions in terms of what should we produce and how should we produce it and who should be consuming what. The general idea is that the invisible hand can do that more efficiently than a central body. So even if we have someone trying their best to determine what we should produce, how we should produce it, who should consume it, then it usually doesn't turn out to be as efficient as if we let the market do it. That's the general idea. And it's generally true. Most people are accepting of that idea. However, there are certain situations when the market doesn't come up with an optimal outcome. And when that happens, a lot of people tend to come to the conclusion that, well, we should throw out markets altogether. And that's not, that's probably not the answer to it, because markets clearly have advanced things. The question that we really need to see is, well, where do the markets fail? How do they fail? What's causing them to fail? And then how can we use both the benefits that markets provide as well as finding ways to alleviate the shortcomings? That's what we need to take a look at. That's where we'll look at this time. So some of the problems: externalities, public goods, imperfect information. So when we talk about the idea of when markets are having problems, these are some of the major areas, and whenever you hear a debate happen about problems in the market, it's probably one of these things that are happening, and that's when we need to talk more about what type of intervention should be there. So government failures are when government intervention actually makes the situation worse. So this is what we're really worried about. Classical economics is often very worried about the government going in with good intentions and having bad outcomes. And so oftentimes the people will think in government that we can go in with good intentions and still have problems because we cannot determine, as well as a free market, how to do certain things, how to produce things, how to manage things, how to distribute things. So whenever we do enter the market, we want to be very careful on how we do in doing so. So externalities. Externalities are the effects of a decision on a third party that are not taken into account by the decision maker. So if we have party A and party B going into a contract making a decision, then the free market works between them two because they both have self-interest. They're going to make decisions theoretically to correlate with their self-interest, and they should both be better off. However, what if there's a third party involved that's affected and they're not involved in the negotiation? That's when there's a problem. So their costs, their needs, whether they're benefiting from this negotiation or not, are not part of the negotiation, and that's when we have a problem of externalities. A negative externality, for example, is when we have secondhand smoke. The argument of secondhand smoke is that, the smoker has an agreement with themselves and or the purchaser of cigarettes, and that's their free choice. However, the third party has a problem, so that's why you got to ban the smoking from certain areas and whatnot. And the idea there, the argument being that the third party is being negatively affected, and the cost is not involved in the agreement. Other types of things, if you built an airport or something like that, the cost of buying the airport and producing the airport is in the interests of the people producing the airport. However, third-party property value and just the noise of the airport and whatnot could bring down property values and things like that, where once again there's going to be problems from people that are not involved in the negotiation. So therefore their costs are not in the negotiation. That's where the problem is. A positive externality occurs when the effects are beneficial to others. So education, often example, so if we get education, we put education in place, the idea being that the educated person will then benefit more of the people around them. Other types of things, if someone was to produce like a lighthouse or something like that and they wanted to produce a lighthouse in order to navigate their ships into their port or something like that, what happens is that everybody else benefits from the lighthouse that somebody put in to navigate their ships into their ports. So there's a positive externality now that is not, once again, in the negotiation between A and B. The person making the lighthouse put up the lighthouse with the contractor for their ships, and everybody else benefited from it. So that's going to be a positive externality that, again, it's not in the cost. We didn't get anything from somebody else for us making the lighthouse. So a negative externality example. When there are negative externalities, the marginal social costs differ from the marginal private costs. So remember what we think about when we're talking about marginal costs, we're making the decision on the margin, and we're talking about social costs, meaning society in whole, and we're talking about those costs compared to the marginal cost to the people involved in the negotiation. So the marginal social cost includes the marginal private cost of production plus the cost of negative externalities associated with that production. So remember, if we left it up to A and B, they're not taken into the externality costs. So if we put A and B in charge of building an airport, and they built a contractor and put in an airport, they're not taking into account the people that are right next to that airport that are going to lose on their property value and whatnot. That's going to be a problem to them. So if we were to graph that, then we can see that if there's no externalities, this was where the equilibrium would be. Meaning if there's a negotiation basically between A and B, then we would have an equilibrium. However, if we take into account the other people's costs, when there are negative externalities, the marginal private cost will be below the marginal social cost, and the competitive price will be too low to maximize social welfare. So what we have in here is, if we take into consideration the marginal social costs, we can see, of course, that we would be at a new equilibrium. The price would be higher. So note the problem here. There's not really a problem with the idea of markets. The idea of markets are still pushing and pulling towards equilibrium. The problem is that we're not getting somehow all of the costs into the agreement, into the negotiation. So once that happens, then if we recognize that, then the question is, government intervention may be necessary in some way to reduce the production. So the question then is, how do we fix that? And of course, we'll talk more about that later. But some of the ideas, there's a few things we could do. We can leave it where it is and see that and recognize that it's not perfect. We can intervene in it in some way and try to push it or make it more fair or make it move towards the more preferred position. Notice that we don't really know what this position is, which is of course part of the problem. Or we can completely take it over by the government, and which of course involves its own problems. So the question there is, is there some way to manipulate or use markets still, because we still want to use the power of them to determine prices, and still kind of use some government intervention through regulations or things like that in order to compensate. And we'll talk more about that later.